For over a century, every American freight train ended with a caboose and the crew who lived inside it. Then, almost overnight, they disappeared. This video reveals why an entire railroad tradition was erased. Step onto the rear platform, open the heavy door, and the smells hit you first. Coal smoke from the small cast iron stove, kerosene from the marker lamps, and stale coffee brewing in a metal pot. This was the caboose, a rolling workspace that rattled and swayed at the end of every freight train in America. It was not a decorative icon or a museum piece. It was a highly practical, active workspace where a crew of railroaders spent their days and nights. Inside, the conductor and brakeman operated a rolling office. On a small wooden desk, bolted to the wall to prevent it from sliding during sudden stops, lay the paperwork. Here, the conductor managed the waybills, the essential documents tracking every car, its contents, and its destination. Writing at this desk required a steady hand and years of practice as the caboose constantly bucked and jarred with the sudden slack action of the steel cars ahead. Looking upward, a short ladder led to the cupola, a raised cabin with small windows offering a clear view over the top of the train. In other designs, bay windows projected from the sides of the car. From these lookouts, the crew kept a continuous watch. They scanned the long line of freight cars stretching toward the locomotive, looking for the telltale white smoke of an overheating wheel bearing, known as a hotbox, or any loose equipment dragging along the gravel ballast. For long-haul crews, this car was also a home. Because freight runs could take days, the caboose served as a mobile bunkhouse. Crew members slept on narrow bunks equipped with heavy leather cushions, which swung slightly on chains to absorb the train's rough motion. They cooked basic meals on the coal stove, shared stories during long delays on sidetracks, and washed up using water from a gravity-fed tank. The men who lived here formed a tight bond, responsible for the safety of the train from the rear. They knew the track by the feel of the curves and the sound of the wheels, living a life defined by the rhythmic click of the rails. When the train at last ground to a halt in a remote yard, the caboose remained their sanctuary, a warm shelter in a cold world of steel. As a freight train rounded a curve, the rear brakeman stood on the caboose platform or leaned from the bay window, watching the forward cars bend away. He scanned for immediate mechanical failures, a sticking brake shoe, sparks flying from a binding wheel, or gravel kicking up from a dragging brake beam. On a train stretching over a mile long, the locomotive crew could not see these issues developing. The rear crew was the only line of defense against a catastrophic derailment. This watch was highly systematized. The conductor, serving as the manager of the entire train, ran the mobile office. Every freight car carried a physical waybill, a paper document tracking its contents, weight, origin, and destination. If a train picked up or set out cars at a rural siding, the conductor immediately updated these records. Without this paperwork, railroad yards could not sort the cargo, causing immediate bottlenecks across the entire rail network. When the train stopped to perform local switching, the rear crew handled the manual labor on the ground. The rear brakeman threw heavy steel track switches, uncoupled cars, and coordinated movements with the engineer. Before the advent of reliable two-way radios, this required a complex language of hand signals by day and hand-swung kerosene lanterns by night, communicating across dozens of car lengths with absolute precision. But the most demanding duty was rear-end protection. If a freight train stalled on a main line, the rear brakeman immediately became a flagman. Operating under strict railroad rules, he grabbed a red flag, lanterns, and small explosive devices called torpedoes. He walked a calculated distance back along the tracks, often up to a mile in blinding rain, snow, or thick fog. There, he clamped the torpedoes to the railhead and stood watch. If another train approached from behind, the torpedoes would detonate under its wheels. sending a loud crack through the air to warn the following engineer of the hazard ahead. This physical protocol protected the train from rear-end collisions, establishing the crew at the back as the final guardians of the rails. In the late 1970s, Class I railroad management shifted their gaze from the tracks to the ledger. In the eyes of corporate accountants, the caboose was no longer an essential operational tool. It was a capital liability. The financial burden of maintaining these rolling offices fell into three distinct cost categories: labor, upkeep, and physical drag. A new caboose in 1980 cost $80,000 to construct, with depreciation scheduled over 15 years on corporate R1 annual reports. Operating it on a standard run cost 92 cents per mile. Inside the maintenance yards, routine upkeep including painting, wheel set replacements, and brake rigging repairs drew between $1,200 and $3,000 annually for every single unit in service. Then there was the physical weight. Hauling a 25-ton steel car at the end of every freight run created a constant drag, increasing fuel consumption by approximately 5%. This weight penalty translated directly into millions of dollars in unnecessary fuel bills across thousands of transcontinental routes. But the most significant line item was labor. Keeping two crew members, the conductor and the rear brakeman, stationed at the back of the train required dedicated wages and overtime that railroad controllers calculated as an avoidable expense. This corporate reclassification was a fundamental mental shift. The caboose was no longer viewed as an indispensable tool, but as a costly redundancy. Long before any electronic device appeared on the rails, boardroom calculations had already marked the car for elimination. This accounting logic created the first structural crack in the system, preparing the way for a physical replacement that would soon arrive. The disappearance of the caboose did not stem from a single catastrophic failure. Instead, the real story lies in a slow shift in how railroads defined safe and cheap operations. For more than a century, placing a crew at the rear of a freight train was an unquestioned rule of the tracks. If a train ran, men had to watch over its tail. But during the late 20th century, the standards of acceptable practice began to change under the pressure of a modernizing economy. The railroad system itself became the driver of this transition, forced to adapt to fierce competition from trucking and rising operational costs. Technology and economics moved together, making the labor-heavy model of the rear crew increasingly difficult to defend. Features of the caboose once deemed necessary, such as the physical lookouts, the paper ledger desks, and manual flagging protocols, slowly began to look like costly holdovers from an earlier era. Rail executives realized that protecting a train did not require hauling a 25-ton steel car with two crew members. This change in thinking quietly paved the way for a physical replacement. The industry was now ready for a small, unmanned machine that could do the same work at a fraction of the cost, turning a century of hard-earned railroad tradition into history. The physical replacement arrived not from a massive manufacturing hub, but from the workshops of a regional line. In the spring of 1969, Dale Cornett, a senior electrical engineer at the Florida East Coast Railway, sat in the new Smyrna Beach shop with his assistant Bob Douglas. The railway had recently ended its passenger services, focusing entirely on freight operations and seeking ways to run trains safely with smaller crews. Cornett and Douglas designed a solution: a compact battery-powered electronic unit that could be bolted directly to the rear coupler of the very last rail car. They called it the end-of-train device, but on the tracks, it quickly earned a more personal name: Fred, or the flashing rear-end device. This 30-pound metal box was engineered to perform the most critical physical tasks of the rear crew. First, it monitored the brake pipe air pressure at the tail of the train, sending real-time data via a radio transmitter to a receiver panel inside the locomotive cab. This allowed the engineer at the front to instantly verify that the braking system was pressurized and intact across the entire length of the consist. Second, the device featured a highly visible red light that flashed automatically in low light, replacing the traditional kerosene marker lamps that once guided trailing trains. In May 1969, the Florida East Coast Railway began prototype trials of Cornette's device on Train 501, a short-haul run between Jacksonville and St. Augustine. By July, they expanded testing to Train 702, a 300-mile grain run down to Miami. The test logs confirmed that the telemetry stayed constant. On September 3, 1969, the railroad initiated the first official revenue run of the new system with Train 801, a diesel freight bound for Port Everglades. Operating without a caboose, the train rolled out of Jacksonville at dawn, proving that a small machine could successfully monitor a train from the rear. The financial reality of running a railroad in the late 20th century eventually came down to a cold, stark comparison of purchase prices and daily upkeep. In 1980, a single new caboose cost $80,000 to construct. On the corporate ledger sheet, this capital asset depreciated over a 15-year schedule, showing up as a constant liability on annual R1 reports filed with the federal government. But the initial purchase price was only the beginning of the financial drain. Once out on the tracks, a caboose cost 92 cents per mile to run. For a standard long-haul route, these mileage charges accumulated rapidly. In the repair yards, the physical demands of constant rail travel required continuous maintenance. Workers regularly replaced worn wheel sets, repaired heavy brake riggings, and repainted the steel bodies to prevent rust, costing railroads between $1,200 and $3,000 per year for every single caboose in service. To pull this 25-ton steel car at the end of every train, locomotives burned 5% more fuel, creating a massive annual energy penalty. An electronic end-of-train device changed this balance completely. Instead of $80,000, a railroad could buy a new unit for just $4,000. The 30-pound metal box was clamped directly onto the rear coupler of the last car in seconds, requiring no modifications to the train. Once in service, the daily operating cost of the electronic device was approximately $25, which covered battery replacements and periodic safety testing. When compared side by side, the math was undeniable. Replacing a fully crewed caboose with a small electronic transmitter reduced the daily operating costs at the rear of the train by more than 99%. Over a typical operating year, the savings per train exceeded $1 million. For a major railroad operating hundreds of freight runs every day, these numbers compounded rapidly. Multiplied across thousands of miles of track, the shift saved hundreds of millions of dollars annually in fuel, maintenance, and equipment costs. From the perspective of corporate finance officers, keeping the caboose was an active threat to corporate survival in a highly competitive transportation market. The arithmetic of the modern electronic device made the elimination of the classic red railcar mathematically inevitable. Behind the cold math of corporate ledger sheets lay a quiet, devastating collapse of an entire way of life. When the caboose was retired, the physical jobs attached to it vanished. In 1980, American railroads employed roughly 532,000 workers. By 1990, that nationwide number had plummeted to just 260,000. While some of this decline came from broader industry mergers and track abandonments, union reports estimated that between 15,000 and 20,000 conductors and brakemen were directly displaced because the caboose was gone. But the true toll was measured in a loss of identity. The rear car was a self-contained world with its own distinct hierarchy, habits, and authority. The conductor was the captain of the train, and the caboose was his command center. From this rolling office, he managed his crew and kept watch over miles of freight, carrying a level of responsibility that defined his standing in the community. He was the master of his own space, making decisions independent of the locomotive crew miles ahead. To be a railroader at the end of the train meant belonging to a tight-knit fraternity. It meant knowing the precise lean of a curve by feel, sharing a pot of coffee over a coal stove during a midnight delay, and ending a grueling shift in a warm, familiar sanctuary. When railroads bolted a 30-pound metal transmitter to the rear coupler, they dissolved this workplace culture. Conductors were moved to the locomotive cab, stripped of their independent command and their private offices, while the rear brakeman's position was eliminated entirely. In the drive for absolute efficiency, a century of pride, routine, and human connection was quietly erased from the American tracks. The United Transportation Union did not watch this displacement unfold in silence. Armed with formal grievances, local strike threats, and the slow machinery of the legal system, labor leaders fought to preserve the caboose as an essential safety asset. They argued that a train stretching over a mile long could not be operated safely without eyes at the rear. Unions buried railroad managers under thousands of safety claims, using procedural delays to keep crews on the back of the train. But the battle quickly moved from the gravel ballast of the rail yards into the wood-paneled hearing rooms of federal arbitration. In July 1982, President Reagan established Presidential Emergency Board 195, which operated under Docket 8201 under the Railway Labor Act, to resolve the worsening dispute. The board's final report delivered a heavy blow to the union's defense. It recommended a national plan allowing railroads to eliminate the caboose, provided they met specific safety guidelines and installed stationary, crash-worthy seating for conductors inside the locomotive cab. With federal policy siding with the railroads, union leadership adjusted its strategy from outright resistance to legal containment. On October 15, 1982, the union signed a new national agreement. Embedded within it was Article 10, a procedural compromise designed to slow the phase-out. Article 10 established a two-tier system, protecting cabooses on specific local runs and limiting cabooseless operations on through freight trains to 25%. This contractual safety net was temporary. On April 23, 1985, arbitrated award 444 swept the remaining compromises aside. The binding federal ruling ordered the retirement of cabooses on new freight runs, setting a hard implementation deadline of July 1, 1985. By negotiating within the system rather than shutting it down, the union's defense collapsed, cementing the change in federal policy. On May 5, 1994, a heavy Santa Fe double-stack freight train, designated PBH-LA 110, began its descent down the steep, winding rails of Southern California's Cajon Pass. As the consist gathered momentum on the punishing grade, the engineer realized the train was running too fast. Despite efforts to control the descent, the wheels lost adhesion on the steel rails, sending multiple cars careening off the tracks. While the crew escaped with only minor injuries, the post-accident investigation quickly shifted from simple operator speed control to a fundamental technical vulnerability at the very end of the train. The National Transportation Safety Board studied the wreckage and examined the telemetry. Investigators found that the train had been equipped with an early, one-way end-of-train device. This first-generation system was a passive reporter. It could monitor the brake pipe air pressure at the rear car and transmit that reading to the locomotive cab, but its capabilities stopped there. It was entirely incapable of receiving commands. When the brake system failed to hold on the mountain grade, the locomotive crew had no way to initiate an emergency brake application from the rear of the train. For decades, union representatives had argued that a machine could never replicate the active intervention of a human crew member. If a conductor or brakeman had been stationed in a caboose at the rear of that Santa Fe train, they would have had immediate access to a manual emergency valve. They could have pulled the air brake lever themselves, venting the brake pipe from the rear and stopping the runaway train before it jumped the tracks. The one-way electronic device, for all its cost-saving efficiency, had remained silent and powerless on the rear coupler. The debate over railroad safety was no longer academic. It carried physical consequences. On February 9, 1996, the Federal Railroad Administration responded to the vulnerabilities exposed at Cajon Pass by issuing Emergency Order Number 18. This federal order mandated that westbound Santa Fe trains operating on the subdivision must possess the physical capability to trigger emergency braking from both the front and the rear. Shortly after, the rule was codified under Title 49, Part 232 of the Code of Federal Regulations, requiring two-way devices on all qualifying mountain routes by March 31, 1996. These updated units added a receiver to the rear transmitter, allowing the engineer to send an emergency radio command that opened the rear brake valve. This transition proved that while a machine could replace a human crew, the first generation of that technology had left a dangerous gap in the armor of the rails. For decades, the physical presence of a caboose was not just a matter of railroad policy or union contracts. In many parts of the country, it was a strict legal mandate. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, state legislatures had erected a patchwork of safety statutes that made operating a freight train without a caboose a statutory offense. These laws meant that even if a railroad owned functional end-of-train telemetry, and even if national labor agreements permitted its use, running a train without a caboose remained illegal under state jurisdiction. These legal barriers did not fall in a single, sweeping federal action. Instead, they were dismantled, region by region, statute by statute, through years of quiet legislative lobbying. In Kansas, during the 1984 legislative session, railroads fought intensely to block new mandatory caboose bills. In Nebraska, a long-standing provision requiring cabooses on any train exceeding 1,000 feet was repealed, taking effect on July 17, 1986. Other states, like South Dakota, quietly moved away from local mandates, leaving rail safety guidelines entirely to federal agencies. The ultimate battleground, and the final holdout, was Virginia. In 1911, the Virginia General Assembly had enacted a sweeping law requiring a staffed caboose on every freight consist operating within the Commonwealth. For 77 years, this statute remained active. Long after other railroads had transitioned to electronic transmitters, trains entering Virginia were legally bound to keep the heavy steel cars attached to their rear. The law had outlived the steam locomotives, the lanterns, and the very era of railroading that birthed it. The end came in early 1988. Following years of sustained industry pressure, the Virginia House of Delegates Transportation Committee voted to repeal the requirement. Under Acts 1988, Chapter 7, the state formally deleted Article 7, Chapter 13, Title 56 from the Code of Virginia. By erasing this final legislative barrier, the state-by-state legal architecture that had protected the caboose for a century officially dissolved. The red rail car was no longer just obsolete on the tracks. It was now entirely unprotected by the law. With the statutory barriers cleared and the technology proven, the physical network of American railroading transformed almost overnight. What took its place was a system of remarkable efficiency. Railroads achieved the logistical ideal they had chased for decades: a cheaper, simpler, and highly standardized freight operation. By stripping the caboose from the end of the train, carriers eliminated a massive maintenance headache. They no longer had to service, switch, turn, and track thousands of individual rolling offices. The end-of-train transmitter did its job silently, safely, and without complaint, operating at a tiny fraction of the cost. The entire logistics network became more fluid, as trains could be assembled and dispatched without waiting for a specific, dedicated rear car to be shunted into place. The departure of the caboose represented far more than the retirement of an obsolete piece of rolling stock. It was the quiet dismantling of a working culture built around observation, responsibility, and craft. The crew on the rear platform possessed a highly specialized sensory understanding of the railroad. They didn't just monitor the train, they felt it. Experienced conductors and brakemen knew the health of their train by the particular sway of the car, the sharp smell of hot metal carried on the wind, and the rhythm of the wheels clattering over the rail joints. They held an intimate, localized knowledge of the territory, reading the changing grade and the behavior of the cars for hazards that no centralized computer or wayside sensor could ever anticipate. This is not to suggest the old way was perfect. The caboose was often a brutal environment, filled with coal dust, drafty bunks, and the ever-present danger of slack-action injuries that could throw a worker across the cabin without warning. But within that challenging environment lived a broad pool of human judgment. In replacing a heavy red car with a 30-pound electronic box, the industry rendered an entire form of human knowledge obsolete. The new system simply had no need for the intuitive, eyes-on-the-ground vigilance that had defined railroading for a century. This fundamental trade-off lies at the heart of the caboose's disappearance. In exchange for the financial survival and operational precision of the modern rail network, the industry sacrificed a rich human ecosystem. The localized command of the conductor was replaced by centralized algorithms, and the active, watchful presence at the rear of the train became a passive, automated signal. It is a transformation that reveals why the story of the caboose is so much larger than railroading alone. It represents a recurring human dilemma, the quiet, calculated decision to trade the irreplaceable depth of human craft for the undeniable power of industrial efficiency. Today, a cold, flashing light guards the end of the train. The caboose's quiet retirement was never just about railroads. It was an early blueprint for our automated present. As machines steadily replace human oversight across every industry, we face the same calculation. Trading human connection for bottom-line efficiency. The tracks ahead are clear, but the true cost remains unmeasured. What do you think we lose to progress? Let me know below.